Hi, my name is Gil Robertson, president of the African American Film Critics Association. Today, we're thrilled to be talking to Alexis Aggrey, one of the creatives responsible for the upcoming film, Becoming Thurgood. We're going to kick things off by introducing you to the AAFCA members on the call today, starting with Kim Singleton in New York, New York, Miss Tatiana in New York, New York, Evan Jackson in Los Angeles, Daryl Lockhart Jr. in LA, I believe, Nancy Green in Los Angeles, Karan Lenoir Kelly in Charlottesville, Virginia, Jill Monroe in LA, and Michael Sorrell in Washington, D.C. I'm going to let you guys do what you do so well, and I will see you on the other side.
Thurgood Marshall was a wonderful human being who also happened to be an icon.
Legally speaking, he's one of the founding fathers.
Whatever was going on, people said, don't worry, Thurgood's coming.
Thurgood's coming.
Thurgood is coming.
He understood how to use the power of his voice. So he wasn't just a litigator, he was doing so much more.
He had to know the law up and down and backwards, and he did.
Here you have this eloquent storyteller, Mr. Civil Rights, arguing, and it was inspirational.
He's the only Supreme Court justice who was more famous for what he did before rising to justice.
The work and life of Thurgood Marshall literally changed this country in ways that were incredibly positive and that still resonate today.
Hello, Alexis. Kim Singleton out of New York City, Consider It Black-led podcast and television show. I love how you focus on Thurgood, all the work he did before he was on the Supreme Court. And I know with the documentary, sometimes it's hard to fit all the information in. Is there anything that you wish you could have included or elaborated on that didn't make the cut?
I think there were a couple of stories that we didn't get to fit in. We fit in quite a bit in just the hour, but if we had had a little bit more time, I think we would have spent some time on the levity and sort of his life and spoke about his wives and sort of he was important not just to American history, but he was also an important figure during the Harlem Renaissance. And he was friends with people like Cab Calloway and lived in Harlem, you know, at sort of the height of this new Negro movement. So it would have been nice to spend some time there to introduce his first wife and talk about their love story a little bit, but there wasn't enough time.
Thank you. It sounds like you need a part two.
Thank you, Ms. Aggrey. My name is Tatiana, and I'm with Medium Popcorn Podcast. And one of the things I remember learning about Thurgood is that he had his passion for law began with almost like a punishment assignment and pulling the Constitution and reading some pieces of that. And it made me interested in learning possibly what was surprising for you and in learning all these things about him. What was the most surprising fact?
I think so that I think is a good example of without sort of familial input, the story gets sort of contorted. So that story has been kind of debunked a couple of times. He was actually a really good student and his mother was a teacher. The likelihood that he was disciplined in that way is kind of unlikely. He actually went to the gifted and talented Black school. Not only did he go to the Black school, we went to the gifted and talented Black school. And he was, his father really loved the law. And even though he was a steward at an all-white country club, on his days off, he took the boys, Aubrey, his older brother, and Justice Marshall Thurgood, to watch cases in the Baltimore courthouses. And that is the beginning of his love for the law. And also the boys in that house, as they were known on the block, had these violent debates. They would yell and scream and argue with each other and litigate just about anything. So one of the things that I think was sort of surprising or really interesting, because I think we think about Justice Marshall and his work, and scrolls and scrolls and scrolls of contribution to American history, but he was like a cool guy. Like he was like a frat guy and like very gregarious. And people used to come in the Supreme Court, the clerks talk about, going just to sit, listen into the stories that he would tell in the evenings. And I wish we could have included things like that in the film, but there just really truly wasn't enough time on the clock. But I think finding out that he was like funny and like the guy, like the guy everybody wanted to hang out with, hilarious, tall, thought of as like strapping and very handsome, which he didn't really care much about, but like I don't know. I think about humanizing him in that way and that making his work even more interesting.
Thank you so much.
Hi, Evan Jackson from Young, Bold, and Regal. I wanted to ask, from your perspective, from your research and you as a filmmaker, what do you feel his life's purpose was realized and unrealized in today's time? Like, we know his impact, but how much further do you feel like we need to go?
I think that's a really, really powerful question. Justice Marshall often talked about it being one case at a time. And so we think about Brown as this like pivotal case, like this big, thing, but he didn't think about it like that. He was thinking about every jurisdiction, every case was just as important as the next case, because he felt like for America to live up to its highest ideals, the law had to be equally applied to all people. So I think if Justice Marshall was still living, I think we would have seen his jurisprudence evolve beyond race. It would have gone into economics. It would have gone into the LGBTQIA space. It would have gone into lots of spaces, because for him, when we start talking about life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, when we talk about all men are created equal, he's like, okay, all, like that means all. So I think his jurisprudence would have continued to evolve. And I think his humility was really truly one case at a time. So I think we would have seen, had he continued practicing and never ascended to the bench, I think we would have continued to see him make landmark case after landmark case, and sort of fight for these decisions until his death, which he did on the Supreme Court. When you read his dissents, or if you ever read his dissents, I mean, he is really wagging his finger at America, like we can be better and we can do better than what we're doing for poor people and different people. It extended beyond Black people.
Most definitely. Thank you.
I hope I'm answering these correctly.
Oh, you're doing great, Alexis. This is Karan Lenoir Kelly from Karanism.com and Love Music Pleasure. And I'm so glad to have you here. His life and memory is as profound as it is prophetic. And there's something to be said for or about what was watched, worked, and a wonder to our world that remains prophetic even 70 years later. It's a prophetic movement for current and future leaders. What do you feel about that as the producer, as a director? How do you feel about how relevant his trajectory in life still is right now?
I really like this question. I think I've been answering this question a lot in the last couple of weeks. And I think because of the time that we're in right now with the current administration and sort of the current climate of our Supreme Court and our sort of national jurisprudence, I think that it feels super relevant. But to be honest, when we were making this film, I thought Kamala was going to win. And like we were in a very different time. So we were sort of imagining this film when we were creating it to be a sort of rallying cry to young people that are thinking about law and sort of law enforcement and the sort of practice of law, to try to encourage. There's no active civil rights movement, and even Black Lives Matter can be controversial, to some, depending on your generation, depending on what part of the pillar you've read down to. People have strong opinions on that. But what I think we need is what we always need, and I think Charles Hamilton Houston encouraged this of the class of lawyers that Justice Marshall was a part of, was that we need a group of young people that are always challenging laws, and they're always actively working to make life better for people that life isn't great for. And I think right now why a project like this is so important is because I hope that it's accessible for lots of different groups of people. We've created sort of educational resources and shorter screeners that don't have some of the more challenging storylines in it for the classroom. And my hope is that we encourage a new generation of civil rights lawyers to step up and to commit their lives to changing America and holding America to its highest ideals. I think the work that he did was thankless by and large while he was living. Even though he was Mr. Civil Rights, it was thankless, but it was so incredibly important, and we are all better for it. So my hope is that projects like these don't just rate, selfishly, don't just rate so that we can get more projects like these funded. But I hope that young people are able to access this history and see themselves in it so that they're encouraged and motivated for more.
Thank you so much. I was also taken aback by how stunningly beautiful the art and the images and the music was. So thank you for this offering.
Thank you. Thank you for saying that. I feel like I got to make a film with my friends, and the composer Derek Hodge, who is one part of the Robert Glasper Experiment, and a Grammy Award-winning jazz musician on his own. We have been trying to find a project to work together on for years, and this was finally the one. So I'm, super grateful.
It was the right time because y'all did that. Thank you.
Hi, my name is DJ Lockhart. I'm also a composer, but my question for you is, in putting together this documentary, have you found that it has reshaped or influenced how you view the state of current civil rights work today and or the tools that we need to carry it forward?
Yeah, I think we're all, I really like this question. I think when we think about civil rights law and what's going on right now, and because of the accessibility of content and content creation, and the way that people see the news and read the news and hear the news, right? Like, I think right now everybody's looking for like the landmark case and the landmark soundbite. But the reality is that this work is about little victories, little tiny victories in jurisdictions that nobody's ever heard of that become landmark decisions that change the nation. And I think a story like this right now is really important because while we all mourn the life of George Floyd, and it was awful to see that man executed live streaming on national television and on our phones, the reality is that real lasting change and impact happens when we acknowledge all of those little grievances, and we don't make one bigger than the other, that say all of their names needs to be the way that we sort of move into this next chapter of trying to make America live up to its highest ideals. If we're only looking for the viral moment, we miss that there is a critical mass of work and litigation and change that needs to happen for impact to be felt, globally and nationally. So I think a project like this sort of reminds us that it was one case at a time. Brown for him wasn't Brown. It was just the next case. It was the next step. I don't think he ever really realized all that he was imagining and all that sort of that group of civil rights lawyers were imagining when they were at Howard Law, sort of in this incubator with Charles Hamilton Houston. I don't think we ever sort of got to realize his dream. But I think he started something and wanted a torch to be passed generation to generation to generation. It's why the Legal Defense Fund now still funds and encourages these large cohorts of civil rights lawyers, because there's an active need.
Hi, I'm Nancy Green. And my question really is about something that I didn't see in the documentary. Um, as I was watching it, I kind of became curious, so I did a bit more research. And he had a lot of involvement with the Masons and the Prince Hall Masons, and I
So
believe
glad.
that he publicly. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I'm so glad you're asking this question. Please continue.
Okay. And he publicly spoke about how the Prince Hall Masons funded a lot of what he did, a lot of the civil rights movement and things like that. So I was wondering just if you could speak a bit more on that and his involvement there.
So I love this question because not only did the Prince Hall Masons fund quite a bit of his work after Groveland, but they also were the reason I believe he lived through all of those rural towns and communities. They acted as a security force, frankly. Prince Hall Masons are the Black Masons, if you know anything about sort of the Masonic order. So there was a significant several scenes in this film about the Masons. What inevitably happened is that we couldn't really tell the full story without sort of a Mason telling the story. And it just felt too speculative, too, secrets of sort of the Masonic order, and it didn't connect well enough in what we had in the can, and we basically ran out of money and couldn't rearrange things. But I love that you asked that question because there's some significant work that's coming out soon, some books that are coming out soon that sort of talk really specifically about his time with the Masons. But I you're right. It is a glaring omission, mostly because we could not find a Mason that felt comfortable enough talking about all of the sort of aspects of how he became connected to the Masonic order. But yeah, you're totally right. I love this question because it is one of those things that you're like, well, people don't know, so they won't know. But I'm glad that you're asking because they were incredibly important, not just to Thurgood Marshall, but to Black people in America, in our history. The Masonic order transcended race in the times of enslavement. If you were a Prince Hall Mason and you were being lynched and a white Mason saw your ring or saw a necklace or recognized that you were connected to the order, they would make sure that you survived. And that is a powerful story and testimony about sort of race relations in this country that I think should have more light.
Nice, thank you. Yeah, and it was fascinating, and so I kind of did a deep dive. I'm still researching, so yeah, it's very
A
interesting.
book coming, Larry Gibson. There's a book, don't print that I said that, but a book is coming. Larry Gibson, who wrote Young Thurgood, is planning and is a Mason, is planning to sort of tackle that story.
Okay, nice, thank you.
Thank you.
Hello, I'm Michael Sowell from Washington, D.C., currently in Toronto, Canada right now, so I apologize for the background noise. First of all, I just want to give you your flowers for running this search into the documentary because from the Gen Zs and Gen Alphas, they're unfortunately going to a generation where their history is being erased.
So my connection to Black history and the way I've made my living, bought my homes on Black history and telling stories about Black history and Black culture. And for me, not knowing what he sounded like wrecked me. My mom who is my business partner, could not believe that I didn't know what Thurgood Marshall sounded like. Because he was on the news every night for her. She's a product of, she was born in the 50s, lived through the 60s and 70s. He was on the nightly news every night, fighting for some injustice. And I think what became very clear for me is that I was really inspired by just hearing his words. And my son, who is Gen Alpha, was really moved by hearing his words directly. Very little editorializing his words. He is the narrator of this film, and we do that through an oral history that was found at Columbia. So I think this generation of young people had the great pleasure of employing Gen Z and raising Gen Alpha. They want history without any editorializing. They want to understand what's going on, what happened, and what's the context. And we are just now able to tell a really complicated story in a way that I'm not sure Gen X or the boomers had the bandwidth for the level of detail that I think we're now seeing. No shade, because I'm an extennial, but the reality is that I think we're able to tell a really nuanced story because this generation wants to know the context. They want to know what was going on in the world when these things were happening, what was being played on the radio, what were the headlines, and how does this, how do these cases, how does this work connect to what was really happening in the world? And my hope is that this project sort of gives you a window into that for the folks that didn't get to live through it.
Jill Monroe, KBLA Talk 1580. Alexis, one of the things that struck me as watching this was the period when he was known as Mr. Civil Rights. And he was like our first Black celebrity in that sense. And people would travel with their families to go hear him speak and learn about the things that he was fighting for, and would then pass that down to their children and their family members. It is something that we kind of has been, I guess, commercialized in our version of celebrity now when they speak on things. So can you talk a little bit about that period and the threads that connected to where we currently are with celebrity and politics?
I think there's always, Sherilyn Ifill, who I was awestruck interviewing her. I was like hanging on her every syllable. It was actually not one of my proudest professional moments. But she says there's a place for everybody in the movement. And people often try to look back at that time period and come up with like, oh, Thurgood Marshall didn't like Martin Luther King. Well, that's not really true. What he said was that he didn't think he didn't think Martin was an organizer. He thought he was a charismatic leader that drove to the hearts and minds of the American people. And he was palatable for white audiences and palatable for conservative, older Black people. And the reality is that without Dr. King, who was a young agitator, for Marshall, he was like a more established, a civil rights leader and lawyer's lawyer at the time. And, here are these young whippersnappers, John Lewis and Dr. King getting arrested every week and interrupting his, plan to litigate all these cases. Like, now I got to get y'all out of jail because y'all are on TV. Now I got to put resources towards that, So but what I think that sort of dichotomy brings about is that there's a role for everybody in the mission and in the revolution. And for Thurgood Marshall, we often conflate him with Dr. King and John Lewis and Malcolm X, and we make them all one thing. And the reality is that Justice Marshall was a lawyer's lawyer. If you broke the law, even if the law wasn't just, you go to jail and you should go to jail. He agreed with that. You should go to jail if you break the law. His role in the revolution, in my opinion, was to change the law. So the young people agitated, and his job was to document and to argue and to litigate and to bring other laws to the fore to change that law. So, his role as a celebrity, I don't know if it would exist in the same way. I don't know that we need a Johnny Cochran in civil rights law, in that way again, but we do need people dedicated to changing the laws one case at a time, one family at a time, one issue at a time. And I think that, we see that we have, examples of young people that are famous, frankly, for agitating and for being, on the front lines of these movements. And lesser known now because of just time and the way celebrity works. We don't know the lawyers that are on the front lines, but a Sherilyn Ifill, who was also director counsel, after Justice Marshall for the Legal Defense Fund, they litigated just like Justice Marshall every instance of, a racist ad, as she says in the film. And I think it's important, celebrity or not, for there to be someone that is continuing that charge and feeding that machine to sort of right the ship towards righteousness, so that the law is equally applied to all people.
Amazing. Thank you.
Alexis, in the documentary, he was described as a defender of all Black people, which I love. And it was connected to, I think what you had mentioned, this racist ad about some candy. And he wrote a letter. Are there any other instances of causes he took up that were kind of outside of his legal cases?
Um, so it's interesting. I think every case he made it a legal case. He made, the things that he encountered that were wrong, he litigated. And we think about Brown as one thing, but Brown was really two cases. And the reason it was two cases is because the District of Columbia wasn't a state. So that had to be sort of litigated differently. And it was and what they challenged was public accommodation, beaches, and sort of public pools and things like that. So we think about Brown from an education standpoint, but Brown too is the reason why we have public beaches that are integrated and pools are integrated, not just schools. So when I think when you ask the question, were there causes outside of the cases that he brought? If it was something he thought was wrong, he brought that case. He brought the case. And Cheryl Cashin, who's also in the film, I think she's one of the people that speaks around that segment, was a clerk for him, and she talks about how, he was a rock star. He was a maverick and a rock star. But he was a maverick and a rock star because he poured his whole life into this work. After hours, he sat and talked to the clerks and gave them the glory days and the war stories about traveling the South during segregation. So I think he litigated the cases. I'm not aware of a case that he didn't make sure, even if he didn't litigate it himself, he didn't make sure was taken care of by the Legal Defense Fund.
Yes, a lawyer's lawyer. Thank you.
Also, I am loving this conversation. I am such a nerd. I love just like taking info and whatnot. So I appreciate everything you're saying and all the questions my colleagues are asking as well. With that being said, because I know this particular documentary is only about an hour, it's on PBS, one of my favorite stations. What would be some recommendations you would give for people who are looking to add on to the information you're providing to them and do their own research?
I think this is a really good question. There's a lot of content that exists in terms of like oral histories and like hearing Justice Marshall speak for himself. There's an oral history at Yale. And there's lots of sort of footage and audio records. Voice of America, something that we sort of touch on briefly, but we don't really get an opportunity to expand on in the film, is that Justice Marshall during the 60s and 70s committed himself to African countries that were getting they were being decolonized. So Ghana is an example, Kenya is an example, Tanzania are examples of countries that needed to write constitutions for the very first time. And they looked to people like Thurgood Marshall, who traveled to Africa and traveled to these countries to help write these constitutions. Because of his work in the civil rights movement in America, and because of his ascending to the bench, who better? Who better than to help draft these constitutions? So I think, one of the things that was really interesting to me, I'm Ghanaian, my last name is Ghanaian, I'm Ghanaian, my father is Ghanaian. And I think about Kwame Nkrumah being his classmate at Lincoln. And then later on in their careers, Kwame Nkrumah is liberating Ghana, but also calling upon his former classmate to like, come help us draft this, come help us justify this. So I think there are lots of stories that could be told and can be read about. There are plenty of books from amazing biographers that sort of deep dive into more stories about Justice Marshall's life. I think there's not a lot of films that are sort of family, certified. But there are a lot of books that are really, really powerful in sort of telling the story of his life after sort of civil rights and what else did he do? Because he did a lot.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And always wonderful work and just the commitment to providing history as factually accurate as possible. I know it's hard. So thank you again.
Thank you.
Hi again. Talk about the social impact of Thurgood Marshall, almost like the metaphorical tree of, who he inspired, Jesse Jackson's, those who came after him, and almost kind of like a how-to manual of not only being a rock star, a celebrity, but bringing that attention back to the cause.
I think he was a really great example. I was so nervous getting this story that I was going to dig into this man's background and find out horrible things. And I am like really pleased to report that that is not the case. He was a stand-up guy. He was married twice. His first wife died of cancer, and he gets married very quickly after she passes. But the reality is like, he's a man of a certain time. He needed to be married. I have no judgments of that, today. But he was really an example. And I think about maybe not Jesse Jackson as much, but I think about President Barack Obama when I think about somebody just being like painfully aware of all eyes are on me. And the moment I do anything, my bias is going to be everything I've done is going to be overturned because of some bias. So much so that what I learned about him is when he ascends to the bench, he stops going to church. Like he doesn't want anybody to be able to say they're friends with him or this cause is connected to something, that a friend of his at church or somebody that he doesn't even know at church funded. He doesn't want there to be any instance of impropriety. And I think that in and of itself is a really important example, especially for our leaders today. I think I look at the bench, the Supreme Court, and the folks that we have on the Supreme Court today, and it's horrifying to me the amount of partisan politics that these justices participate in, even to the level of like fundraising for candidates and speaking out and providing sound bites for candidates. He would have never, to be honest, he wouldn't have allowed this project to happen if he was still living. So I think socially he was keenly aware of how important the life he lived, the way he walked as a man, not just as an American, but as a Black man, as a husband, as a father. He was keenly aware of how that directly affected how people saw the decisions he made, the cases he took, and the things that he won. And he wanted to forever be able to say, I won 29 of my 32 cases. And I don't want anybody to say the reason for that was because, somebody at church or something, something I was affiliated with or participated in, disrupted that in any way. So I really like that question because I think it nods to something that's really important right now, this weird.
Yeah, and I like to say that, with Thurgood Marshall, for his career, he's the Muhammad Ali of civil rights lawyers, where his record is the last accolade of what he does. It's more about his impact in his time and beyond that time. So thank you.
Absolutely.
Hey, it's Karan again from Karanism.com, and I got to challenge you on something.
Okay.
Because you said something about Gen X.
I
Okay, somebody started a live that said if you were born in the 1900s, ... I have 3 children who were born in 3 different decades. And I disagree about the narrative about how our generations relate because intergenerational relationships were a huge part of my development in life. And what the role of legacy actually means. And I'm from Baltimore. So I grew up with him being everywhere.
Yeah.
In books, in buildings, on blocks, in hip hop, when we actually use words in hip hop, that thing.
Yeah.
But our level of understanding was different because our parents were there and they took us with them there. So we have a different level of experiential care, if I can say that. Just like his father took his children to court to see how these cases were being argued that shaped him. So
I like this challenge. I like this challenge because I have a
thank
thought.
you.
I have an answer. I have an answer for why I feel the way I feel.
Okay, so
But you finish your question.
and I'm getting to the end. His application, his college application at Lincoln asked about specifically what did he think was going to be his life's work. But the young have a lot to learn about delayed gratification and focus.
Yes.
So what can younger generations learn about staying committed to a cause that you experienced versus something that you just heard about?
I really like this question. So because or this challenge and question, because the reason I feel like that is because I think about massive resistance. So Brown v. Board happens, and then massive resistance happens all over the United States of America, not just in the South, everywhere. The Mid-Atlantic, Virginia, live in Virginia. Virginia closed the schools. They closed the schools so as to not integrate, right? But when you talk to people that lived through that time, they don't remember. They have no memory of it. I think civil rights and what happened to the people that were on the front lines of the civil rights movement was so traumatic that I think it created a group of really, really conservative people that were scared for the dangers of being on the front lines of any movement, any social movement, especially one where the law can be involved, where people were being beaten. Like we talk about civil rights and we talk about March on Washington, which had no incidents. It was a peaceful protest. There were millions of people and it was peaceful. There were no incidents. But every civil rights protest wasn't that. When you think about the Memphis sanitation strike, people were beaten and bruised. Dr. King was assassinated. We talk about the Poor People's Campaign and people camping out on the Washington Monument, at the Lincoln Memorial on the reflecting pond. Those people they got rained on for a month. They were in absolute, it was treacherous. And we talk about it like it was like everybody got to sing and sway and it was this beautiful thing. And the reality is that we don't tell the story of what it was to walk to the March on Washington, which some people did. They walked from Florida. Somebody roller skated from Chicago to the March on Washington. And because we don't tell that story, because the generation that could have told that story was tired. And rightfully so. I in no way is that a criticism because I think that people were being lazy in the storytelling. I think they were fatigued. I think there was no way to tell that story without crying and looking disheveled in front of your children that you brought with you to the panel to talk about what you did. Do you know what I mean? So there was, and I don't think it was intentional, but I think there was a sanitizing of what that work looked like. And I think today, because George Floyd's death was streamed live, frankly, right? I think today we can tell a story that doesn't cut out the fact that he almost was lynched, and it doesn't cut out the fact that the Masons moved him every night. He didn't stay in the same house twice because a Molotov cocktail might have entered the front room and he was running out the back. So we didn't tell that part of the story, but we have to, because if we don't tell that part of the story, then there's a generation of people that think, oh, civil rights wasn't that bad. Like the civil rights movement, I grew up thinking it was just about politeness. It was about white people using the N-word. It wasn't about that. Cheryl Lynn Eiffel, when we started shooting this and we got to the Cheryl Lynn Eiffel interview, I had read all these papers of lawyers that challenged Brown. Well, was America ready for Brown? America wasn't ready to integrate. These kids went to these schools and got mistreated. They got beaten and beat up and had to run out of school, and the National Guard had to be called. Like, it wasn't the "we shall overcome" swaying and singing that we often distill it down to. So when I say this is the first time that we're able to really tell that story, because unlike my mom's generation, right? Like, I can tell it without it being, it hurts to know that this was America and this is the truth about America. But I can tell that story differently than somebody that is having PTSD, remembering what it was to be locked up and sit in jail and, eat whatever, and, all the things that the realities of Selma, the realities of the Montgomery bus boycott. We talk about those things, we clump them all up into one thing, and then we all sing, lift every voice and sing, and everybody feels good. But the reality of the segregated school system is that children were relieving themselves in lime pits. There was one schoolhouse for K through 12 and one stove warming the entire school and one textbook for all grades. We don't tell the story right if we don't actually talk about the atrocities of what Jim Crow really was, the dangers of lynching, the realities of not having due process, that you could have a coerced confession. The sheriff could chain you up to the grates in the basement and beat you senseless. That those things could happen. And if we skip over those or just say bad things happen, the next generation doesn't know how bad it really was. And we have a generation of people that think civil rights was about getting goodies for Black people and not using the N-word publicly, which that wasn't really the case.
You were absolutely right, because I grew up with a mother and father that were both civically active, and all of my children have worked the polls, and my children are through 3 different decades. So we grew up working the polls, understanding what it meant to bleed for a vote.
Yes.
And many of these young people, they have no context, because we want our children to have better lives than we did. But what that meant, what we're seeing now, is that meant not talking about what actually happened.
Yes, so that's what so that is what I meant by that, not that
no, I just wanted to rag on you a little bit, but it's
listen, I can take it. But I mean, I think in the way that we all know who Thurgood Marshall is, we should all know who C.T. Vivian is. And we should all have seen the footage of C.T. Vivian getting punched in the face for
Ruskin.
Lawfully, right, to try to lawfully register people to vote.
Rustin. Yeah.
So,
I'm here for it. Thank you for the fight. Thank you for the continuance of the fight, because it doesn't end, but it does evolve. So I thank you for this work.
That's right. It does.
How do you view, how do you view film as an instrument of advocacy today? And I guess, where does this documentary fit within that timeline, if that makes sense?
I really like this question. I've been thinking a lot about this. I've been thinking a lot about this because I think as a young woman, I can remember protesting. I can remember having petitions and participating in petitions. I've worked at National Geographic, and I was like, Greenpeace down, and environment, and save the planet, and all these things, right? But I think about documentary work and the work that I do similarly to Thurgood Marshall, and that it's one piece at a time. And it's one story at a time, hopefully changing the zeitgeist of storytelling and the sort of American landscape of storytelling. I think for me, all of the public work that exists of me right now is there's no narrator. I always allow the people that live the story to tell the story. And it's my little revolutionary protest in that I felt like I learned about Africa through the Joberts and through British white men. And for me, having to see, literally, I'm Tree and Fanti, and having to see my tribal people being explained to me by a British white man is crazy. That's crazy. So for me, I feel like the role in the revolution, because I do think there's a role for me in the revolution, while I don't think I'll leave protesting to my son in that generation and getting arrested to my son in that generation. I'll work on my real estate portfolio while I'm trying to build generational wealth so that I can leave something to this young man. But what I think about when I think about sort of the role in the movement is that it's one film at a time. We tell this story in this way as authentically as we can, hopefully sparking a new generation of civil rights lawyers and people to be civically involved and to understand that people bled for these votes and people bled for your active participation in the government that governs you. They work for you. It's not the other way around. Like, but it's one film at a time. So when this film ends, it's the next story to inspire the next group of people. We produced 1/3 of the Obama Presidential Museum that's opening next year, and also contributed to the Urban Civil Rights Museum that's coming to Harlem for the National Urban League. Each of those sort of places of telling stories, they're not all film in a feature or television documentary sense, but I'm hoping that our contribution to sort of the like American zeitgeist of like content creation and storytelling changes the way that we engage with our historical figures. So hope that answers.
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
So I wanted to touch upon something that you said earlier that I was also thinking about when I was watching the documentary, and that was about how like his personality, like they came from so far to hear him speak, and it was like an event, and he was just known as like this guy who was very charming and everything. And I wanted to know, also, you just now you spoke about like the differences between like what you want to do in terms of like civil rights and things, and your son. And I've always kind of felt that, whenever you're talking about this kind of a fight, it's always important to know that there are multiple pieces and multiple roles, not just one way of going about it. So I wanted to know, especially in this time now, what can people learn from Thurgood and the work that he did and the way that he approached it and the way that he worked with the people that he worked with in, making these changes?
I love this question. I think Charles Hamilton Houston, his mentor, that was the dean of Howard Law School, it required perfection. And he required perfection because to challenge people, to challenge your enemies at a sport, that they made the rules and the rules are the rules and they're established rules, you have to project perfection. And he did that in his work. It's so much so that legal briefs, this is the time of typewriters. He didn't allow liquid paper. There was no liquid paper. If you made a mistake, you typed the entire thing again. And that was a requirement that came from Charles Hamilton Houston, was taken to the Legal Defense Fund. Obviously now we don't have typewriters and you can just backspace, but this idea of crossing your T's and dotting your I's when you're going into enemy territory. And I think it's a poignant lesson. It's an important one. But I also think that in the life that he lived, he was also this like gregarious, like he was like that guy. Like he was a Mason, he was an Alpha. He, hung out with Cab Calloway and was like on the scene in the Harlem Renaissance when he wasn't on these trains litigating these battles. So I think it's also a reminder to be a whole human, to fall in love, to live a life, to have children, to get married, I think in this pursuit of making it being change makers, as President Obama often says, we're looking for change makers. We're trying to create change makers. Like when we're in this pursuit of change, we also need to live lives, live a full life. You don't need to pretend you're living a full life, live a full life, authentically. So I hope that answers.
Okay. No, it does. It does. Thank you. Thank you. And yeah, very interesting, very good documentary.
Thank you.
And yay, PBS.
Jill Monroe. So one of the through themes that I saw throughout this conversation, as well as in the documentary, was strategy, that he utilized a lot of strategy for everything, which is something I think we don't see or talk about as much, the steps that take there to get us there, the small victories that culminate into something bigger. So if you were kind of putting together a cultural playbook based off of Thurgood, or, outlining some, key strategy points to incorporate in our fight for our freedoms, literally at this moment, which points would you sort of include in there or touch upon along the way?
You know, it's interesting. I think strategy is like a really important part of what his work looked like. But I also think the part that's really important is that he was willing to pivot, that he was honest about, when segregationist like Brown happens, right? They were not ready for massive resistance in the way that massive resistance happened. There were overnight, there were thousands of cases all over the countries and school districts closing because they didn't want to integrate the schools. And I think what he says in the documentary and what is true about strategy is that you have to be willing to pivot. You have to constantly be, value assessing what am I doing and is it working? And if it's not working and my adversaries have pivoted and now they're challenging something else rather than completely, shifting gears, observing that pivot, whatever that is, I think about banning of books in Florida, and that became a huge deal in the last couple of years. So much so that many organizations, the Omegas, decided to buy all the banned books and donate them to the libraries and the community centers and things like that, right? But it's about that. It's about taking note of all these little things that are happening in Texas. The whole country is looking at these gerrymandering cases in Texas and thinking about strategies of how, okay, well, if we're going to lose 5 there, how do we make up 5 somewhere else? Now, legally speaking, if I was a lawyer's lawyer, I don't know what my opinion on that is. But in the strategy, the larger strategy of the revolution, that's people taking note and thinking like Thurgood. That is people, Gavin Newsom, changing the way that he tweets to mirror Donald Trump and everybody being offended by the crude nature with which he tweets. Well, his base didn't have a problem with electing him in this way, So I think it's that. I think it's not being so pious as to thinking I'm on the side of righteousness and surely righteousness is going to carry me through. It's also allowing the Gavin Newsoms of the world to fight in that way. It's the Omegas buying the books and donating them to the community centers and the Black owned bookstores to make sure that these books are not lost, and that there are young people that have access to books about Black hair, because that is not something that needs to be policed. But I think it's that. I think the strategy isn't just one thing. I think it's a lot of things. I think it's people paying attention nationally to all the little fights that are happening in these regional fights, because the reality is the only way to bring about a case to the Supreme Court is for it to go through all the different circuits, all the local circuits. That's how we make lasting change. So, hopefully that answers your question, but I think it's about observing all the strategies that are happening and bringing attention to them so that we can all pitch in.
Amazing. Thank you so much.
Alexis, thank you for this amazing project, and thank you for granting us the pleasure of having some time with you this afternoon. On behalf of the world's largest group of Black film and TV critics, thank you for joining us for this edition of AAFCA Roundtables. Have a great day.